The headlights died first. That was the detail Dorothy Callahan would remember longest. Not the cold, not the weight of the carrier in her arms, not even the sound of the engine fading into the storm. It was the precise moment the red glow of the taillights shrank to two small points and then simply ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the dark and the snow, as if Marcus Hale had never been there at all. As if she had imagined the entire drive, the silence in the car, the way he had handed the baby to her, with the same flat efficiency a man might use to pass a box of files to a colleague he was letting go. She stood on what she believed was still a road, though the distinction between road and forest floor had dissolved sometime in the last mile. The wind came in lateral sheets, not falling, but driving, forcing itself into the gaps between her coat buttons, between her scarf and her collar, between every assumption she had carried into this night about what a human being was capable of doing to another. The baby carrier hung from her right hand. Inside it, her granddaughter, 11 days old, born into a world that had already decided she was inconvenient, made a sound so thin and reedy, it barely registered against the howl of the storm. It registered against everything else Dorothy had. She did not move for what felt like a full minute. The cold was not gradual. It was declarative, a physical statement of fact pressed against every exposed surface of her skin. Her left hand gloveless, she had tucked one glove into her coat pocket before leaving the house and had not been able to find the second. In the dark of Marcus's car began to lose sensation along the fingertips first, then the knuckles, then the palm. She switched the carrier to her left hand and buried her right inside her coat, pressing it flat against her ribs. The thought arrived without drama, which was the most frightening thing about it. It would be so easy to sit down. The snow was deep enough to insulate. The cold would stop being pain fairly quickly. She understood that much from a winter first aid pamphlet she had read 20 years ago at the school library where she had worked. It would become warmth, which was the cruelest trick biology played on the dying. She could set the carrier down beside her, pull Wren close against her chest, and let the mountain take them both. It would be a kind of answer to everything Marcus had done, not a surrender exactly, but a refusal to continue performing for a world that had looked at her 73 years of living and found them disposable. Then Wren made the sound again. Not a cry, not yet. Something smaller and more alarming than a cry. A hitching, effortful intake of breath, the sound of a chest working harder than it should for something so new. Dorothy looked down at the carrier. In the diffuse gray light of the snow itself, she could see the baby's face, a small red knot of concentration, and cold, the lips already beginning to lose their color at the edges. She watched that face for 3 full seconds and felt something shift in the architecture of her own chest, a rearrangement of whatever had been collapsing since the moment she stood at her daughter's graveside 4 days ago, and understood that Claire was not coming back. No, not you. The words were not heroic. They arrived the way the most important decisions always arrived for Dorothy Callahan, quietly, without announcement, from a place below language. She had made the same kind of wordless choice when she was 22 and her mother's diagnosis came back, and the art school acceptance letter sat unopened on the kitchen table for 2 days before she finally carried it to the trash. She had made it again when her husband Thomas collapsed in the parking lot of the Maple Creek hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and she had stood over his body while the paramedics worked and quietly reorganized every plan she had made for the next 30 years. She was not a woman who catastrophized. She was a woman who looked at the new shape of things and began figuring out how to live inside it. She turned her back on the road. The tree line accepted her without ceremony. One step into the forest and the wind dropped, fractionally broken by the density of the spruce and hemlock crowding the slope. The snow was deeper here, uncompacted, taking her boot to mid-calf with each step. She had worn the boots out of habit. She always wore them. In November had worn them to the funeral, had worn them every day since, because pulling on proper winter boots was one of the few functional things she could still do in a week that had otherwise dismantled every routine she possessed. The boots were the reason she was not already dead. She understood this without particular gratitude. It was simply the kind of detail that mattered. The carrier grew heavier within the first 100 yards. It was not heavy in the objective sense. Wren weighed just over 7 pounds, and the plastic and foam of the carrier added perhaps 4 more. But 11 pounds held at arm's length through uneven terrain in the dark, with no path, with the snow concealing every root and rock, and depression in the ground accumulated into something genuinely punishing. She fell twice in the first 20 minutes. The first time she went down on one knee and caught herself with her free hand, plunging it wrist deep into snow, and the shock of the cold against her palm was so complete it erased every other sensation temporarily, which was almost a relief. The second fall was worse, both knees the carrier swinging wide, Wren's cry finally breaking open into something full-throated and furious. And Dorothy lay there in the snow for 10 seconds, listening to that cry and finding in it something she had not expected to find: evidence. The baby was breathing. The baby was angry. The baby was alive and demanding that the world account for itself. Dorothy pushed herself upright. She was in the objective accounting of her situation. A 73-year-old woman alone in a Vermont wilderness in the early hours of a November blizzard, with $11 and change in her coat pocket. A photograph of her dead husband and her dead daughter, tucked into her left breast pocket, and a newborn baby whose lips were turning blue. She had no phone. Marcus had suggested she leave it home, had said the signal was terrible in the mountains, and she had believed him, because she had wanted to believe that the drive was what he claimed it was: a chance to talk, a chance to find the version of her son-in-law that Claire had loved, and that Dorothy had watched disappear degree by degree over 4 years of a marriage that had slowly convinced her daughter that her own instincts were wrong. She had wanted to believe in that version of Marcus for Claire's sake long after the evidence had stopped supporting the belief. That credulity had put her here. She filed the knowledge away, not for later recrimination, but because understanding the mechanism of a mistake was the only way to avoid making it again. And Dorothy Callahan was above everything else a practical woman. She moved. Not with direction, not with confidence, but with the obstinate forward lean of someone who has decided that stopping is the only option that is not available. The forest around her was immense and indifferent, the ancient hemlocks and firs carrying their loads of snow with a patience that predated human concepts of tragedy by several centuries. Their branches brushed against her shoulders and caught in her hair. Twice a branch, weighted with ice, released its load directly onto her back, the impact enough to stagger her. She registered each obstacle, adjusted, continued. The cold had moved from the sharp initial assault into something more systemic, a deep internal cooling that she recognized as dangerous without quite feeling it as pain anymore. She kept moving because movement was the only physiological argument she had left. She had known Marcus Hale was dangerous before she had known how to name what she was seeing. The knowledge had arrived in the form of small accumulations over 4 years. The way he spoke about money, not as a means but as a metric of personal worth. The way he received good news about his career with satisfaction while receiving good news about Claire's pregnancy with something that looked in certain lights like irritation. The way he was unfailingly polite in front of other people and unfailingly absent in private, present in body, but attending to something else entirely, some internal calculation that never resolved in Claire's favor. Dorothy had raised her daughter alone for 16 years after Thomas died, and she had done it on a school librarian's salary supplemented by seamstress work on weekends, hemming the dress pants of men who made in a month what she made in a year, mending the costumes for the regional theater's productions, taking in the alterations that the dry cleaners on Main Street sent her way because she was reliable and her stitches held. She had done it without complaint and without the performance of hardship that might have made the sacrifice feel properly witnessed. She simply did it. She kept the bills paid and the refrigerator stocked and Claire's tuition funded. And on the day her daughter walked across the stage at the University of Vermont to collect her diploma, Dorothy Callahan had felt a satisfaction so complete and so private that she had not even been able to explain it to Thomas's photograph later that night. It was not pride exactly. It was the feeling of something done correctly. When Claire brought Marcus home for the first time, Dorothy had been polite and attentive and had served dinner and asked good questions about his work and his family, and had noticed with the specific attentiveness of someone who had spent 3 decades watching children in a library determine what they actually meant rather than what they said. That Marcus answered every question about himself in terms of where he was going rather than where he had been. He had no nostalgia. He referenced his parents once briefly to establish their professional credentials and then did not mention them again. He was interesting and engaged and clearly capable, and he looked at Claire with something that resembled love. And Dorothy had driven home afterward with a feeling she could not quite articulate, something between unease and grief, as if she were watching a door close that could not be reopened. She had said nothing. She was not the kind of mother who said that kind of thing, not because she lacked the courage, but because she understood that Claire was 31 years old and had come to her own conclusions through her own experience, and that Dorothy's unease, however well-founded, however consistent with everything she subsequently observed, was not data that Claire was positioned to receive. Love was not a rational project. Dorothy knew that. She had loved Thomas with a completeness that ignored every inconvenient fact about him, including the fact that he worked too hard and rested too little, and refused to take the chest pain seriously until it was 4 years too late. You did not argue people out of the architecture of their attachments. You stayed close. You waited. You tried to be the thing that was still there when the rest of it fell apart. She had given them the down payment. Every dollar she had saved across 30 years of double shifts and self-denial, $62,000 in a savings account at the Maple Creek Savings Bank that she had never touched, even during the 2 years when the school cut her hours, and she had been genuinely uncertain about making rent. She had handed Marcus the check at their kitchen table, and she had watched him look at it not with gratitude, but with the quick calculation of a man assessing a figure against a balance sheet. He had thanked her correctly. He had said all the right things. Claire had cried and hugged her, and the hug had felt like everything Dorothy had worked for, and she had driven home and allowed herself to cry for 20 minutes, and then had stopped and made dinner and filed the memory away in the category of things that had been worth it. She did not know then that she had just handed the keys of her own future to a man who would one day use them to lock her out. It was during what she would later estimate as the second hour. Though time had lost all meaningful structure, by then reduced to the interval between one footfall and the next, that she noticed the depression in the snow. It was subtle enough that she almost walked through it without recognition, dismissing it as a natural feature of the terrain, a drainage channel or an animal track. But there were 2 of them parallel, running at a diagonal up the slope, spaced roughly 4 feet apart, and regular in a way that randomness did not produce. She stopped. She looked at them for a long moment, her cold, slowed brain working through the implications. Parallel tracks meant wheels. Wheels meant a vehicle. A vehicle meant a road, or at least something that had once functioned as one. And a road meant that at some point in the history of this mountain, a human being had decided that this direction was worth going. She placed her boot into the left track. The ground held differently, firmer, more compressed, the frozen crust of old soil rather than the soft trap of undisturbed snow. She took another step and felt the same. Whatever had made these tracks had compacted the earth enough that it still held weeks or months or years after the last passage. She began to follow them up the slope, her pace steadying slightly. On the more reliable surface, the carrier held closer to her body. Now rain quieted again into that shallow, intermittent breathing that was more frightening than the crying had been. The tracks curved east around a massive granite outcropping, switchbacked once, and then straightened into what was unmistakably a path. Not a maintained path, not a trail with markers or cleared sightlines, but a path in the oldest sense, a way that had been traveled enough times by something that it remembered the traveling. Dorothy followed it with the specific, focused attention of a woman who understood that this was the only thing she had been given, and she was not going to miss any part of it. The slope steepened. Her thighs burned with an intensity that cut through the general numbing, and she was briefly grateful for the pain. because it confirmed that her legs were still receiving adequate circulation. She stopped twice to catch her breath, both times standing with her eyes closed and her head tilted back, breathing deliberately, counting herself back from the edge of the dizziness that had begun to appear at the periphery of her vision. The second time she stopped, Wren stirred in the carrier and made a small questioning sound, not a cry but something almost conversational, as if the baby was checking whether anyone was still there. Dorothy looked down. "I'm here," she said, and the words came out rougher than she intended, abraded by cold and exertion, into something barely recognizable as her own voice. But she said it again, steadier this time, because Wren could not see her face and needed the information. "I'm right here. We're going somewhere." She had been walking for what she now estimated as close to 3 hours when the clearing appeared. It did not announce itself. One moment, she was in the dense interior of the forest, hemlock branches pressing in from both sides of the track, and then the track widened and the branches withdrew, and she was standing at the edge of an open space, roughly the size of a large backyard, the snow in it undisturbed and luminous, reflecting back the dull glow of the storm clouds. And at the far edge of the clearing, backed against a sheer face of exposed granite that rose 20 feet before disappearing into the dark, was the cabin. It was not large. It was not welcoming in any conventional sense. The logs were dark with age, and weathering the single window she could make out was nearly opaque with grime and ice, and the porch sagged at the left end where a support post had shifted in its foundation. But the roof was intact. The chimney fieldstone, massive, built by someone who understood that this was not a decorative feature, but a structural argument, rose straight and solid into the storm. Dorothy crossed the clearing and climbed the 2 porch steps and pushed against the door. It did not open. She pushed again harder, setting the carrier down on the porch boards and using both hands pressing her shoulder against the planks and driving with her legs. She felt the door shift fractionally, the wood swollen in its frame, complaining about the intrusion. She adjusted her stance, got lower, drove again. The door moved another fraction, and then with a low, reluctant groan that built and then broke. The door scraped inward just enough for her to squeeze through, dragging the baby carrier behind her into the welcoming darkness. The dark inside was different from the dark outside. It was still and purposeful. The wind did not reach here. Dorothy pulled the door shut behind her and stood in the blackness and breathed. The cold inside was the cold of abandonment rather than weather, deep and settled and dry. It lacked the malice of the outdoor cold. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out the shapes of the room, a table in the center, chairs around it, the humped shapes of furniture covered in canvas sheeting along the walls, and dominating the far wall, the fireplace. Even in the dark, she could see its scale, the opening large enough to stand in the fieldstone surround, stretching almost to the ceiling. She moved toward it, and her hand found the wooden box to the right of the hearth. She felt it before she saw it, her fingers closing on the rough-hewn edge of a crate, and inside it, the unmistakable geometry of split logs. She lifted one, dry, light, properly aged wood that had been sheltered long enough to give up its moisture completely. Beside the crate, her fingers found smaller pieces kindling. Actual kindling, deliberately split fine. And on the mantelpiece, her palm brushed a tin box, and inside the tin box, when she pried the lid open with numb fingers, the round, waxy cylinders of wooden matches. She counted the matches by feel, 11. She needed to do this once. She set the tin down and took one match and struck it against the inner wall of the tin, and it sputtered and went dark. She waited. She pressed her hands together hard and rubbed them, drove some blood back into the fingers, then picked up the second match and struck it. And it caught, not dramatically, not with any sense of narrative justice, but as a physical consequence of friction and chemistry that cared nothing for the circumstances surrounding it. A small yellow flame in the dark of an abandoned cabin in a Vermont blizzard, and Dorothy touched it to a shred of dry moss she had gathered from the kindling bundle, and the moss accepted the flame and she placed the burning moss under the smallest pieces of kindling in the hearth, and leaned close and breathed on it slow and steady, the way her father had taught her 50 years ago at a fireplace in a farmhouse that no longer existed, and the fire caught. It was a small fire. It was the most important thing in the world. Dorothy pulled the canvas from the nearest chair. A rocking chair. Solid construction. The joint still tight, and dragged it to within 3 feet of the hearth. She opened the carrier and lifted Wren free with hands that had begun only in the last few minutes to feel the early stages of returning sensation, which was its own particular pain. The baby's skin was cold to the touch. Not the cold of real crisis, but the cold of a small body that had been losing the argument with the temperature for hours. Dorothy opened her coat, held Wren against her chest, skin to skin at the neck where her collar was open, and closed the coat around them both as much as it would close. She sat in the rocking chair, and she rocked and she watched the fire build. Wren's breathing steadied within 20 minutes. The blue tinge receded from her lips. Dorothy rocked and watched and added wood to the fire with careful timing, not loading it too fast, letting the bed of coals develop properly the way you had to with a cold hearth that had not drawn heat in years. By the time the room had moved from actively dangerous to merely cold, the fire was stable and self-sustaining, and Dorothy understood that they were going to survive the night. She thought about Marcus's face in the car. Not the moment of abandonment. She had no interest in rehearsing that, but the drive itself, the 40 minutes of silence, and the specific texture of Marcus's quiet during it. It was not the silence of someone who was nervous or conflicted, or even angry. It was the silence of someone executing a plan, running through steps, confirming that each variable was in order. He had told her when he called that they needed to talk about Wren's future. His voice had held a note she recognized as effortful. He was calibrating it, adding warmth that did not originate from anything warm. She had known this and gone anyway, because the alternative was to leave Wren alone in that house with a man who had already made clear that his daughter was a problem in search of a solution. And whatever Dorothy's presence accomplished, it was at least a witness, at least a body between Wren and the cold arithmetic of Marcus Hale's attention. She had understood somewhere around the point where the pavement ended that she had been led here deliberately. She had sat with that understanding in the particular stillness that had characterized her responses to terrible news throughout her life. The stillness of a woman who had learned that visible distress was a luxury that circumstances rarely permitted. She had not anticipated how bad. She had imagined confrontation, cruelty, perhaps some form of legal threat. She had not constructed a version of events in which he drove her to an unmapped location in a blizzard and left her there. The gap between what she could imagine and what he was capable of was, she now understood, the precise distance between her understanding of human beings and his. He had said it without raising his voice. "She's not my daughter. She's my liability. Now she's yours." He had said it in the same tone he used to discuss quarterly projections, and that tonal consistency was the most revealing thing about him. Not the act itself, which was merely monstrous, but the absence of any emotional register around the act. Leaving a 73-year-old woman and a newborn baby in a blizzard had not required him to become anything other than what he already was. She rocked in the firelight. Wren slept against her chest, her small hands curled at her sides in the way of newborns, as if she was still carrying something from wherever she had come from. The cabin groaned around them as the wind pressed against its walls and the walls held. The fire spat, once settled, continued its quiet work. Dorothy looked at the room in the growing light of the fire and began very carefully to assess what she had. The table was solid. The chairs were functional. The canvas-covered shapes along the walls suggested furniture that had been deliberately protected, not abandoned in haste, but put away with some expectation of eventual return. The floor was deep with the dust of years, but the boards beneath were thick, and the joinery was honest, built to last rather than to impress. The fireplace drew properly. She had watched the smoke rise clean and straight. And there was no backdraft, no blockage in the flue. She had shelter. She had fire. She had a baby who was warm and breathing. The man who had brought her here had driven away believing that the cold and the wilderness and the arithmetic of her age and her resources would solve his problem for him, and he had been wrong. And she intended to make sure that his being wrong had consequences he had not planned for. But that was a project for daylight. Right now, the project was this chair and this fire and this child and the next few hours. She thought about Claire, not in the punishing recursive loop of the last 4 days, but about Claire as a child, 7 years old, sitting on the floor of the school library after hours while Dorothy reshelved the returns reading with the total absorption of someone for whom reading was not a skill, but a metabolism. Dorothy had nurtured this with the same quiet consistency with which she had nurtured everything about her daughter, without program or performance, simply by making sure there were always books and always time and always a lamp on. Wren shifted against her chest and made the questioning sound again, the one that meant she was checking whether the world was still there. Dorothy tightened her arms and rocked. "I've got you," she said. And the fire answered with a soft settling. Pop. And outside the storm continued its indifferent work, and inside the cabin that had no business existing in this place. Dorothy Callahan held her daughter's daughter and made the decision, without drama, without announcement that she was not finished. She was in fact just beginning. The first morning arrived without ceremony. The storm had spent itself sometime before dawn, and the silence it left behind was the particular silence of a Vermont winter, after heavy snowfall, absolute pressurized, as if the world had been wrapped in something dense enough to muffle its own heartbeat. Dorothy woke in the rocking chair, with Wren still against her chest, both of them having slid into sleep at some point in the small hours without intention or awareness. The fire had burned down to a thick bed of orange coals that still radiated serious heat, and the room had achieved something approaching livable temperature. She sat for a moment without moving, taking inventory of her body the way a mechanic might assess an engine that had been run hard under bad conditions. Her lower back had locked during the night and announced itself immediately. Her left hand ached at every joint with a persistence that suggested the beginning of something she would need to manage carefully. Her feet, still in the winter boots, were merely sore rather than damaged, which was the best news she had received in 4 days. Wren woke at almost the same moment, not with crying, but with the escalating physical insistence of a hungry infant. Dorothy understood the immediate problem with complete clarity. She had nothing to feed her. The baby was 11 days old and needed milk, and there was no milk. She stood settled, ran back into the carrier, and began moving through the cabin with the systematic attention of someone conducting a professional assessment. She had spent 3 decades in a library cataloging what existed and what was missing, and she applied the same methodology now. The canvas-covered shapes along the walls yielded a second chair, a narrow cot frame, a small writing desk, and a shelving unit. The writing desk had a single drawer, and in the drawer she found a rusted compass that still worked, a stub of pencil, and a small spiral notebook with the first 12 pages used columns of figures. Dates in the 1970s, the handwriting of a methodical person. She kept the compass and the pencil. The kitchen area occupied the right side of the main room. A dry sink, a small wood-burning cookstove separate from the main fireplace, and a row of open shelves that held 3 empty mason jars. A cast-iron skillet, dark with decades of seasoning, and a tin container that held roughly a cup of dried beans. On the lowest shelf, pushed to the back, were 2 items she had not noticed in the dark. A small tin of evaporated milk, dented but sealed, and a box of powdered infant formula with a faded label and an expiration date from years past. She stood holding the formula for a long moment. It was far past any date that should have given her confidence. She was going to use it anyway because the alternative was not feeding Wren at all. She would dilute it carefully. She would boil the water first. She would watch. The formula was the second impossible thing this cabin had provided. She did not allow herself to find this meaningful yet. She simply added it to the inventory. Wren accepted the first feeding with the focused desperation of someone who had been patient past the limit of patience. Dorothy held her and watched her eat, and felt the terror of the previous night reorganize itself into something with more right angles, still present, still real, but structured now, around specific problems that had specific addresses. She was not free of danger, she was not rescued. She was warm, the baby was fed, and those two facts created a platform from which the next hour could be approached. The larger danger had a name and a face and a plan, and she needed to think about it clearly. Marcus had not called the police the night she disappeared. She was nearly certain of this. He had no interest in a search and rescue operation that would find two survivors instead of two bodies, and would require him to explain in front of law enforcement and likely a judge why he had driven his mother-in-law and his newborn daughter to an unmapped logging road during a blizzard. His plan had relied on the mountain doing what mountains do to unprepared people. When that plan failed, his next move would be constructed around the same principle that governed everything he did: the protection of his own position. He would wait. He would build a story. He would become, in the telling of it, the concerned husband who had been left to grieve alone while his unstable mother-in-law had taken the baby and vanished. He would give it a week, perhaps two, and then he would file a report that positioned him as the victim of a troubled older woman's erratic behavior. Dorothy understood this with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had watched him operate for 4 years. The story he built would be clean and sympathetic and entirely upside down. This meant she could not go to the authorities first, not without evidence, not without something that could stand against the polished, reasonable version of events that Marcus would have already begun constructing. She needed time, and the mountain which Marcus had intended to use against her was currently her most reliable ally. She spent the first 3 days learning the cabin's structural logic. The gaps in the chinking were addressable. She worked them with a combination of wet mud from the thawed earth along the cabin's foundation, packed while still pliable, and sealed with a layer of fresh moss pressed into place before the mud froze again. It was slow work crawling along the base of the walls with her bad hand. But by the third afternoon, the draft in the main room had dropped to almost nothing. She swept the floor with a broom she assembled from a bundle of hemlock branches bound with a strip torn from the canvas sheeting. She dragged the cot frame to the corner nearest the hearth and made up a bed from the remaining canvas and her own coat, which she had stopped wearing indoors once the room temperature stabilized. She worried most about the formula. The tin of evaporated milk had given her 2 additional days of feeding diluted carefully with boiled water. But it was nearly gone, and the powdered formula was the only remaining option for perhaps 10 days before she would need to find another source. She made calculations in the back of the spiral notebook. A newborn needed roughly 24 ounces per day. She had formula for perhaps 8 days, at that rate less if Wren's appetite increased as she grew. After that, the arithmetic stopped working in her favor unless something changed. Something changed on day 9. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, which would have alarmed her, but a single human sound, a low, non-threatening clearing of the throat from the direction of the tree line, at a distance calculated to be unthreatening. She was at the wood pile at the side of the cabin, stacking the last of the hemlock rounds she had managed to break apart with the iron poker from the fireplace, which she had been using as a splitting tool with limited but functional results. She turned. A man stood at the far edge of the clearing, tall, in his late 60s, dressed in a dark green canvas coat that had seen years of outdoor work. His face weathered into the specific topography of someone who had spent decades in wind and sun. He held nothing. His hands were visible at his sides. He looked at her with the calm, direct gaze of a person who was comfortable with silence and had no interest in using it as a weapon. "Chimney's drawing well." His voice was unhurried, the vowels of a man who had grown up in these mountains and stayed. "But that hemlock burns fast. Won't last you." He let a moment pass. There's a stand of dead oak on the east ridge. Fell last summer. Dry through by now. Burns slow, burns hot. He gave a single nod and turned back into the trees without asking anything, without demanding any accounting of her presence or her circumstances. He simply offered what he knew and left. She stood at the woodpile for a long time after he disappeared. The crate appeared 2 mornings later at the base of the large pine at the clearing's edge, not on her porch, not intrusive, but placed at the boundary in a way that made clear he understood the difference between helping and encroaching. Inside, a 5-pound bag of flour, a block of iodized salt, a small hand axe with a new handle, and at the bottom, 3 cans of commercial infant formula with current expiration dates. There was no note. She stood over the crate in the morning cold and felt something she did not immediately name, something that lived in the same register as grief, but ran in the opposite direction. A sudden, sharp awareness of what it felt like to be seen by someone who asked nothing in return. She would not learn his name for another 2 weeks when he appeared again at the tree liner on a gray afternoon. And this time she was close enough that conversation became a natural rather than an imposed thing. Franco Sai, he said, like it was information rather than an introduction. Retired now. Used to be forestry service. She said Dorothy Callahan, and he nodded in a way that suggested he had already worked that part out. Or at least the part that mattered, that she had a right to be here. Or had made one which, in his understanding of things, amounted to the same. He told her the East Ridge oak was hers to use if she needed it. He told her the water table under the cabin ran clean, and she could dig a seep well in spring if she dug it right. He told her a man in Harwick serviced the kind of wood stove that a cabin like this needed, and that the man's name was Patterson, and he was honest about his prices. He did not tell her what to do. He did not offer to manage the situation. He gave her information as if she were a capable person who could use it because he was reading her correctly. On day 17, while Wren slept in the improvised crate cradle Dorothy had built from a box she'd found under the cot, Dorothy pulled back the braided rug in the center of the room to sweep beneath it. Her foot found the loose board before her eyes did a specific deliberate give beneath the sole of her boot that was different from the ordinary flex of aged timber. She crouched, ran her fingers along the edge of the board, and found the seam. Rectangular, regular cut with intention. She moved the rug fully aside and saw the outline clearly in the afternoon light. A trapdoor set flush with the floor, its edges fitted closely enough to have been invisible under the rug for however many years it had sat there. The stone in the fireplace hearth came back to her immediately. 3 days into her stay, she had noticed one stone near the base of the firebox that sat differently from the others. Its mortar crumbled at the edges, its surface darker with a quality that suggested it had been removed and replaced more than once. She had worked it free with the iron poker and found behind it a small cavity containing 2 items: a heavy iron key brown with rust, and a folded piece of cloth on which someone had written in ink, so faded it was almost gone for blood for those who find their way back. She had tried the key on every visible lock in the cabin without success, had nearly concluded it was decorative, and had left it on the mantelpiece where she could see it while she worked. She crossed the room now, retrieved the key, and returned to the trapdoor. The keyhole was small and flush-mounted, barely visible until the light hit it at the right angle. Her hands were steadier than they had been on the mountain. She inserted the key. The bolt disengaged with a sound like a decision being made. She lifted the door. The smell that rose from the space below was the smell of the earth itself. Cool mineral alive in the way that deep soil is alive, and underneath it something sweeter. The ghost of fruit preserved in glass and sugar and time. She found the lantern on the shelf beside the hearth, lit it, and descended the short wooden ladder into the cellar. The shelves lined all 4 stone walls, floor to ceiling, and on them, preserved by the constant cool of the buried earth, were the remnants of decades of deliberate provision. Green beans, wax beans, pickled beets, and carrots. Several varieties of jam and row after row of the maple syrup. that Vermonters had been laying down as a hedge against hard winters since before the state had a name. The glass was old, the lids beginning to oxidize at the edges, but the seals held and the contents were sound. She stood in the cellar and counted jars until she understood that she was looking at somewhere between 8 and 12 months of caloric provision if she was careful, and she was always careful. The military footlocker was at the back, half obscured by a collapsed shelving unit she had to drag aside to reach it. Olive drab brass corners, 2 heavy latches. She stood looking at it for a moment before she reached for it. Whatever was inside had been placed here by someone who wanted it to survive. She did not open it that afternoon. She climbed back up the ladder, pulled the trapdoor closed, and replaced the rug. She sat beside the fire with Wren in her lap and let the afternoon light move across the room while she considered what it meant that someone had built this place and stocked this place and hidden something inside it and had somehow expected that this was not the end of the story. She carried the footlocker up the following morning when the light was good and Wren was settled. The latches were stiff, but not locked, and they opened to a smell of oilcloth and preserved paper that was specific to objects that had been sealed and cared for. Inside, wrapped carefully, were 3 items: a thick document bundle tied with a faded red ribbon, a small heavy tin, and on top of it all, an envelope in cream-colored paper with a single word written in strong black ink across the front: family. She opened the letter first. The paper inside was thick, the ink brown with age, but perfectly legible. The handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship in an era when it meant something. The date at the top read September 14th, 1965. The salutation read, "To whoever of my blood finds this place." Her grandfather, George Callahan, had written the letter in a single sitting. She could tell by the consistency of the ink. No pauses to refill, no shifts in pressure that would indicate he had put it down and come back to it. He wrote with the directness of a man who did not have much experience with being emotionally articulate and was making the effort anyway, which gave the letter a quality of compressed feeling, each sentence doing more work than it appeared to. He wrote about building the cabin with his own hands over 2 summers in the late 1940s, hauling the granite for the chimney from the rock face behind it, notching every log himself. He wrote about his difficulty with people, not hostility, he was careful to clarify, but a genuine inability to understand the social mechanics that seemed to come naturally to everyone else, and the resulting pattern of withdrawal that he recognized from a distance had caused real harm to the people he loved. He apologized without excusing, and without the performance of self-flagellation that would have been its own kind of self-absorption. He said, "I know what I cost you. I know what distance cost the people left on the other side of it. I could not fix it in the time I had, so I have tried to fix it in the form I understand. And then the world may try to break you, but the land will hold you. Come home. Build something that lasts." She read the letter twice, then set it beside her on the table and untied the ribbon from the document bundle with hands that were not entirely steady, not from weakness, but from the specific tremor that arrived when the body recognized that it was about to receive information that would rearrange things. The deed was on top. Original registered in 1948 with the county clerk of Windsor County, Vermont, conveying ownership of 250 acres of land, described in the attached survey to George William Callahan and his heirs. She read the survey description carefully, tracing the boundary lines in her mind against the topography she had spent the last 3 weeks learning with her feet. The land ran from the logging road where Marcus had left her all the way to the boundary of the national forest on the northeast face, encompassing the clearing, the cabin, the rock face behind it, and the full ridge of oak to the east. Every step she had taken since leaving that road had been on land that belonged in a direct and unbroken line to her. She sat with that for a moment. The woman who had been left in the wilderness to die had walked through instinct or chance or something neither word adequately described directly to the one piece of ground in New England that was hers by right of blood. She did not believe in providence as a governing principle, but she believed in the occasional alignment of facts into patterns that a person had a responsibility to notice. This was one of those patterns. The tin held the bonds. She could see they were US government securities issued in the early 1950s, and she could calculate roughly that 60-plus years of interest at government rates added up to something substantial. She did not know the exact figure. She would need someone who understood these instruments to tell her. What she understood immediately was that they represented options. And options were what she had been without since the moment those taillights disappeared. She crossed the room and lifted Wren from the cradle. The baby was awake in the particular alert state of a well-fed newborn studying the light. Her dark eyes moving across the ceiling with the focused attention of someone assembling a working theory of the world. Dorothy held her up so she could see the window and the gray afternoon sky beyond it, and the dark shapes of the hemlock trees standing their patient watch. "Your great-great-grandfather built this place," Dorothy told her. "He built it because he didn't know how to say what he needed to say any other way." She paused. "I understand that better than I expected to." The weeks that followed moved in a different rhythm than the first desperate days, harder in some ways, because survival without urgency required a different quality of endurance, the long daily labor of chopping wood and maintaining fire and keeping the cabin provisioned and Wren clean and fed and stimulated. Dorothy's hands changed. The softness that had come from 3 decades of library work and careful sewing gave way to calluses that built up along the palm and at the base of the fingers, and the pain in her bad hand faded as the surrounding muscles compensated and strengthened. She was not young. She was aware of this in every joint and tendon by the end of each day, and she ignored the awareness the way she had always ignored discomfort that didn't serve a useful purpose. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees with sand she melted free from the frozen ground near the south wall, where the sun hit longest. The true color of the wood came up slowly under the work, a deep honey brown that had been under the grime for decades. She scraped the window glass with a flat stone until the light came through properly, and filled the room each afternoon with a kind of low-angled winter light that made everything inside it look considered and intentional. She patched the sagging porch support with a round cut from one of the oak logs Frank had directed her to, splitting it to a rough rectangle with the hand axe and driving it into the frost-heaved soil as a new footing. She sang to Wren while she worked, not performing, not with the self-consciousness of someone constructing a memory, but because the singing occupied a different part of her mind than the physical work and left the practical thinking free to run. She sang the songs her mother had sung to her and the songs she had sung to Claire, and occasionally hymns from a church she had stopped attending after Thomas died. Not from anger, but because the building had stopped holding what she needed it to hold, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The cabin held more. It was on a morning in the 3rd week when she finally understood what she was doing. Not surviving, she had known that much from the first night. She was building a counter-argument. Marcus had constructed a version of her life in which her love, her sacrifice, her 73 years of giving without reserve were a liability, a problem that had needed to be disposed of. She was constructing a rebuttal, not in words but in weatherproofed walls and firewood stacked 4 feet high, and a baby gaining weight and color in a handmade cradle beside a hearth that drew clean. Every hour of work was an annotation to his argument. Every day Wren grew was another sentence in a brief that was going to be very long and very thorough, and would hold up in any court that mattered. She thought about the bonds and the deed and what they would require. She would need a lawyer, someone local, someone who knew Vermont land law and didn't owe anything to anyone in Maple Creek. She would need to present herself as a competent adult managing her own affairs, rather than an elderly woman who had been lost in the woods, which meant she would need to be clean and composed and clear when she made that first contact. She gave herself until the ground softened enough to walk the 6 miles to Harwick without losing a boot to mud. The snow began to loosen its hold on the mountain in the last week of March. The south-facing slopes cleared first, And then the path down the mountain became navigable, and Dorothy walked it on a Tuesday morning in early April, with Wren in the carrier strapped across her chest. The deed and the bonds in an oilcloth sleeve inside her coat, and the specific internal composure of a woman who had spent 5 months deciding exactly who she was going to be when she got to wherever she was going. The town of Hardwick announced itself at the bottom of the mountain as a main street of perhaps 8 blocks. The kind of small Vermont town that had been there long enough to stop trying to look like anything other than what it was. She found the law office on the second block. Dillard and Associates, the sign said, though she would later learn that Nora Dillard was currently the only associate. The door was unlocked. Inside, a woman in her mid-30s looked up from a desk stacked with files with the alert, slightly skeptical expression of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly. Dorothy sat down across from her without being invited and placed the oilcloth sleeve on the desk. "My name is Dorothy Callahan. I need to understand what I have here, and then I need to understand what I can do with it." Nora Dillard looked at the sleeve, then at Dorothy, reading the same things Frank had read on the mountain. The weathered hands, the composed face, the quality of attention in their eyes that spoke of someone who had been through something and had not been diminished by it. She reached for the sleeve. "All right, Miss Callahan." Her voice was direct without condescension or performance. "Let's see what we're working with." The bonds had matured to $147,000 after compound interest. The land where Nora pulled the county records and cross-referenced the proximity to the national park boundary and the current developer pressure on that corridor was worth between $3.8 and $4.2 million at conservative estimate. Dorothy absorbed these numbers without visible reaction because the numbers were not the point. They were a means, not an end. And she had already determined the end, which was to build something permanent enough that no single person's decision to discard her could threaten it again. "Do you want to sell the land?" Nora asked, watching her. The answer did not require consideration. "No, I want to go home." She walked back up the mountain that afternoon, with Wren asleep against her chest and a legal consultation receipt in her coat pocket that made everything she had found in the cellar formally, documentably, officially hers. She did not think about Marcus on the walk back. He would become a problem she addressed when she was ready to address it through the proper instruments, with the proper witnesses, and with the full weight of what he had done laid out in daylight where the arithmetic could not be adjusted in his favor. That day was coming. She was not in a hurry because the most important thing she had ever done had required patience rather than speed. The summons reached Marcus Hale on a Wednesday morning in late October, 18 months after he had driven away from a logging road in a blizzard and begun the project of forgetting that he had done so. He was in the process of finalizing the lease on a 2-bedroom apartment in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, a clean, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows and no history, exactly the kind of place a man selects when he is trying to construct himself from scratch. The legal envelope arrived via certified mail forwarded from the Maple Creek address. He signed for it from the building's lobby desk and rode the elevator up before he opened it, which was a habit. He never opened anything significant in a space he didn't control. The filing was 23 pages. He read it standing at the kitchen counter with the Seattle skyline behind him and the coffee going cold beside his hand. By page 4, the careful composure that had served him through 4 years of marriage and 4 days of funeral performance and 18 months of strategic silence had begun to show the specific stress fractures of a man encountering the full dimensions of his own exposure for the first time. Nora Dillard had filed in Windsor County, Vermont. The charges were civil criminal negligent endangerment of a dependent adult, criminal negligent endangerment of a child under the age of 2, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and fraudulent conversion of marital assets. The last charge, referencing the $62,000 Dorothy Callahan had contributed to the down payment of a house that Marcus had sold without accounting for that contribution. The GPS data from his vehicle was listed as Exhibit A. He had not known his car logged GPS data in the format that was apparently available to legal counsel under discovery. He had known it in the abstract the way people know that their phones track them and their credit cards record their locations as a theoretical fact that did not feel real until it was itemized in a legal filing. Exhibit A covered the drive from the Maple Creek house to the logging road and the return drive with timestamps accurate to the minute. The drive out had taken 44 minutes. The return had taken 31 faster, Nora's filing noted, because he had not been navigating unfamiliar terrain in a blizzard on the return. He had known exactly where he was going. He called his lawyer that afternoon. His lawyer listened to the summary without interruption and then was quiet for long enough that Marcus had to ask if he was still there. His lawyer said he was still there and that Marcus should understand the difference between a negotiating position and a liability position, and that what he was describing was closer to the second than the first. He said that GPS evidence of that specificity, combined with the testimony of a retired Forestry Service officer who had documented the condition of the survivor and the infant in the first weeks after the incident, constituted a factual record that could not be effectively contested. "The question is not whether you settle," he said. "The question is what settling cost you versus what not settling cost you." Marcus drove to Vermont the following week, not because Nora had asked him to and not because he had decided to settle, but because he needed to see it. He needed to see what 18 months had produced, because his mental image of the situation had not updated since the night he drove away, and the legal filing had introduced the possibility that his mental image was wrong. He told himself this was information gathering. He was not honest enough with himself yet to name what it actually was, which was the specific dread of a man about to discover the full scope of what his calculations had missed. He found the path up the mountain with difficulty and walked it until the clearing opened before him and the homestead stopped him at the clearing's edge. He had been wrong. This was the first thing that arrived before assessment or calculation, or any of the self-protective interpretations he would normally have assembled by reflex. The garden ran along the south slope in terraced rows, the late-season growth still present in the deep green of kale and the purple red of beet tops, and the yellow of late squash built with a structural intelligence that made clear someone understood the land it was sitting on. A barn, small but solid, stood to the east of the cabin, and from inside it came the irregular percussion of chickens. The woodpile against the cabin's south wall was stacked to 8 feet split clean, covered at the top, with a top weighed down with stones. Someone had thought about February and September. Then he heard wren. The sound came from the garden, a child's laugh breaking open into the afternoon air, with the specific abandon of someone who has not yet learned to monitor the volume of their own happiness. He could see her through the garden rows, a toddler sturdy and sure on her feet, her hair catching the October light as she chased a monarch butterfly through the dying vegetation. She was talking to herself in the narrating way of small children, a running commentary delivered at full volume without any awareness of audience. Marcus looked at his daughter for the first time in 18 months. What moved through him in that moment was not love. It was something more primitive and more ugly than love, a possessive recognition that arrived not from the heart, but from the same place that noted appreciating assets and monitored competitors' market positions. He had discarded this child, and she was flourishing. The discrepancy between those two facts produced something that lived in the same register as anger, but aimed inward, and he did not have the interior architecture to process it. So he pushed it toward the perimeter of his awareness and looked at the cabin instead. Dorothy was on the porch, sitting in a wooden rocking chair, with a large bowl in her lap, her hands moving in the steady, practiced rhythm of a person shelling beans. She had not looked up. He knew she was aware of him. Nothing about Dorothy Callahan suggested a person who failed to register what entered her field of awareness, but she continued the work with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided exactly how much of her attention this moment deserved. And that amount was not all of it. He crossed the clearing and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He ran through 3 opening lines in his head and discarded all of them and settled on the most direct version of what he had come to say, stripped of the framing he would have applied in a conference room. "I got the papers from your lawyer. This is aggressive. This is more than what the situation warrants." He paused. "I want to see Wren. She's my daughter, and I have rights that don't disappear because of one bad night." One bad night. He heard it as he said it. He heard the scale of the reduction and felt for perhaps the first time in his adult life the full weight of his own capacity for self-serving revision. Dorothy placed the bowl on the porch boards beside her chair. She turned her head and looked at him, and the quality of her attention when it arrived was unlike anything he had encountered in the professional or personal arenas in which he operated. There was no fear in it, no anger, no residue of injury that he could use as leverage or navigate around. There was only a clarity so complete it felt almost impersonal, the gaze of a person who had looked at him fully and arrived at a verdict that had nothing more to prove. "Rights are not what you declare, Marcus." Her voice was level and unhurried, carrying the particular authority of someone whose words had been tested against reality and had held. "They're what you earn through the 10,000 ordinary choices that constitute a life. You made your choices. They were very clear." She let the silence settle for a moment. "Wren is healthy, Wren is happy, Wren is exactly where she belongs." She stood, picking up the bowl in a single fluid motion. "Nora Dallard's address is on the filing. Everything you want to say to me, say it through her." She walked into the cabin. The door closed with the quiet final solidity of a well-fitted door. In a well-built frame at the sound of something that had been constructed to last and was performing exactly as intended. Marcus stood on the path below the empty porch and understood with a completeness that no argument could address that he had no move. He had come here with the outline of a negotiating position and had encountered a person who was not negotiating, who had moved so far past the need for his acknowledgement or his remorse that neither would have registered as meaningful, even if he had managed to produce them honestly. He looked one more time at Wren, who had found the butterfly again and was following it through the last row of kale, with her arms out, her commentary continuous and joyful and completely indifferent to the man at the clearing's edge who had helped make her existence possible and had done nothing else useful since. He walked back down the mountain. By the time he reached the vehicle, the clearing was already out of sight behind the tree line, and the only sound was the wind through the October branches and the distant, diminishing thread of a child's laugh. The trial, when it came 4 months later, was not the spectacle that Marcus had hired his lawyers to prevent. It was methodical and thorough and deeply unglamorous, conducted in a Windsor County courtroom before a judge who had been on the bench long enough to have developed a comprehensive immunity to the performance of victimhood. Nora Dillard presented her case with the same quality of attention Dorothy had deployed on the porch. Not aggressive, not theatrical, simply precise, each piece of evidence placed in the record, like a stone being set in a wall. The structure becoming evident only when you step back to look at the whole. Frank Osei testified for 40 minutes. He described what he had found when he approached the cabin for the first time, the smoke from a chimney that hadn't drawn in 15 years. And then when he came close enough to observe a woman in her mid-70s who had made a functional shelter with no resources, was feeding an infant from salvaged supplies, and had sealed the cabin's wall gaps with materials that indicated in his professional assessment as a former forestry officer a working knowledge of cold weather construction or a very fast and accurate improvisation of same. He described the condition of the infant as consistent with a child who had experienced significant cold stress and had recovered. He described Dorothy's left hand, which had sustained minor frostbite damage to 2 fingertips that had resolved with treatment, but left permanent reduced sensation. He described all of this in the tone of a man presenting observed facts, which was all it required. The GPS data needed no advocate. Exhibit A showed the vehicle traveling from the marital residence at 9:47 in the evening on November 11th. Arriving at a point on Forest Road 22B that the county mapping system marked as unimproved and ungated at 10:31, remaining stationary for 7 minutes, and departing at 10:38, returning to the marital residence by 11:09. 31 minutes to return a journey that had taken 44 minutes outbound because the driver had not been lost. Nora read the bank records into evidence with the same unhurried precision. A wire transfer of $62,000 from Dorothy's account at Maple Creek Savings Bank to the joint account of Marcus and Claire Hale, documented as down payment contribution. The house sold 14 months after Claire's death. The distribution of proceeds went entirely to Marcus Hale. The $62,000 was not returned, was not accounted for. In the settlement was not acknowledged in any communication before or after the sale. Marcus's lawyers had spent considerable money constructing the argument that Dorothy had accompanied him voluntarily. The GPS data made the voluntary argument difficult. The 7-minute stationary period made it very difficult. Frank's testimony about a woman who had walked alone through a blizzard for approximately 3 hours before finding shelter made it in the judge's assessment, as recorded in the written ruling, not credible. The civil judgment was $310,000. To pay it, Marcus sold the last significant asset he had not yet liquidated, which was the portfolio of investment accounts he had been building for the previous 8 years. Dorothy did not attend the trial. She sent Nora in her place and spent the days of the proceedings doing what she had been doing every day, which was building the homestead toward the next season and raising a child who deserved a life that felt like the world was fundamentally safe. She received Nora's call on the evening of the second day and listened to the ruling with the phone held loosely and her eyes on the window where the February light was doing its particular thin patient work on the snow outside. She thanked Nora, asked one question about the timeline for the district attorney's criminal referral, and then set the phone down and added wood to the stove and told Wren, who was building something architectural with a set of wooden blocks Frank had shaped for her, that dinner would be ready in an hour. The criminal referral produced charges. Vermont's reckless endangerment statute covered both the child and the dependent adult. Marcus's lawyers negotiated a plea to a single count in exchange for a suspended sentence and community service hours. The guilty plea was the detail that mattered, as Nora explained it, because it was permanent and public and attached to his name in every background check and professional license application for the rest of his life. His company's morality clause activated within 72 hours of the plea. The professional community in which he had built his identity was small enough and well-networked enough that the disclosure traveled faster than he could. He moved to Portland, Oregon. He found work in a smaller firm that asked fewer questions. He lived in a rental apartment and navigated the rest of his life as a man who had traded his soul for a clean slate and had discovered too late that the transaction was not reversible and the slate was not clean. Dorothy did not follow the trajectory of his reconstruction. She was simply occupied with something more important. 5 years settled over the mountain homestead. The way good years do not with drama, but with accumulation. Each season adding something to the whole that would not have been visible in any single day, but was unmistakable when you stepped back. The garden terraces had expanded to include a cutting garden along the western fence line, dahlias and black-eyed Susans, and the tall branching stems of cosmos that moved in the mountain wind, with a looseness that Dorothy found every summer worth stopping to watch. The barn housed 14 hens now, and the 2 goats that Frank had sourced from a farm 2 valleys over, animals with the specific self-possessed intelligence of goats who had opinions about Dorothy's schedule and expressed them at volume every morning until she acknowledged them. Frank had built the porch swing in the second year using black locust. He had milled himself from a tree that had come down in a March stormwood, dense and rot-resistant enough to last a century in outdoor conditions. He came up the mountain 3 or 4 times a week, never announcing in advance, always appearing when there was work that needed a second pair of hands, or when the kind of silence that sits between 2 people who trust each other completely was called for. He was 73 now, and moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who respected his body's accumulating opinion about steep slopes. But he moved, and he was there. And Wren had developed the habit of running to meet him at the tree line as soon as she heard his particular footstep on the path. Nora Dillard had relocated her practice to Harwick in the third year, which she described as a professional decision, and which was, among other things, a personal one. She came on weekends with her laptop and her case files, and spent the morning working at the kitchen table while Dorothy worked in the garden. And in the afternoons, she put the laptop away and did whatever needed doing, mending fence or processing tomatoes, or simply sitting with a cup of coffee on the porch, watching Wren conduct the complex diplomatic negotiations of a 5-year-old's relationship with the natural world. She had become, without formal discussion or ceremony, part of the structure of the place, as reliable as the south wall and as necessary as the water table. The Green Mountain Seed Sanctuary had begun in the 4th year as a practical response to a practical problem. Dorothy had more heirloom seed stock than she could manage alone, saved from 4 growing seasons of careful selection, and she needed to know that what she was preserving would outlast her own stewardship. She wrote 3 letters to farmers in the county and received 7 responses. By the end of the first season, she had established an exchange network covering 62 families, trading seed packets at the kitchen table and in the Harwick Library meeting room on the first Saturday of each month. People brought her seeds from their grandparents' gardens in small folded paper envelopes, seeds that had been traveling through Vermont families for generations, and she catalogued and tested and stored them in the root cellar her grandfather had built for exactly this kind of long-term patient preservation. The woman who had spent 30 years cataloging other people's stories in a school library had found late in her life the archive that needed her most. On an afternoon in August in the 5th year, Dorothy was sitting on the porch swing when Wren came running up the garden path with a piece of paper held in both hands. Her expression, the specific concentrated pride of a child carrying something fragile and important. She climbed the porch steps carefully and presented the paper without preamble, holding it up at Dorothy's eye level with the solemnity of a formal offering. It was a drawing in crayon, the colors bold and unambiguous in the way of a child who has not yet learned to hedge. A cabin with a lopsided chimney emitting a cheerful orange curl of smoke. A sun in the upper right corner, yellow and spiky with rays. 3 figures standing in the foreground, holding hands. A tall woman with silver hair rendered in careful loops. A shorter figure in a red dress, and a man with a wide-brimmed hat whose brim Wren had drawn, extending well past the edges of his head, more hat than man, which was not an inaccurate representation. Wren pointed at the drawing with a chubby finger, identifying each figure with the authority of an artist explaining her own work. Gamma mi franca. She looked up. Homer. The word was a child's word, simple and complete, carrying no weight of loss or recovery, or the long costly passage through which this particular home had been arrived at. To Wren it was simply a fact, the most basic fact of her known world, this place, these people, this swing, this garden, this mountain. She had no memory of the night that preceded it, no frame for understanding the blizzard and the logging road, and the first terrible weeks, no knowledge of the man who had handed her into the dark, with the flat efficiency of someone closing an account. She knew only what she had always known, which was warmth and work, and the specific safety of being loved by people who had decided that her existence was the most important project of their lives. Dorothy pulled her granddaughter onto her lap and held her the way she had held her in the rocking chair in the dark of that first night, not with the desperate grip of someone hanging on, but with the settled embrace of someone who understood what she was protecting and had built accordingly. She rested her chin on the top of Wren's head and looked out at the homestead in the August afternoon light, at the garden and the barn and the woodpile already beginning its accumulation for winter, at the tree line where the ancient hemlocks stood their patient watch, at the 250 acres of Vermont mountain that her grandfather had built into stone and wood and soil as the only love letter he knew how to write. Nora arrived that evening with 2 bottles of local cider from the Harwick General Store and a manila envelope under one arm. She climbed the steps and handed the cider to Dorothy with one hand and the envelope with the other. Patterson LLC, final offer in writing this time. 5.2 million. Dorothy set the cider down without opening it and looked at the envelope. The developer had been circling for 2 years now, attracted by the national park boundary and the increasing premium that undeveloped Vermont acreage commanded from the kind of wealth that wanted to consume wilderness without living in it. She turned the envelope over once. Then she stood and carried it to the wood stove inside and fed it to the fire without opening it the way you handled correspondence that had nothing new to tell you. When she came back out, Nora was watching her with the expression of a lawyer deciding whether to argue with a client and concluding that in this particular case, the argument would be both lost and beside the point. She handed Dorothy her cider. From the barn came the sound of Frank's mallet against wood, a steady, satisfied rhythm that had become as much a part of the mountain soundscape as the wind. Wren had fallen asleep on the swing with her drawing still clutched in one hand, her mouth slightly open, her hair across her face, in the way of someone who had run hard and eaten well, and had absolutely no outstanding grievances with the world. The sky above the Hemlock Ridge had gone the deep saturated blue of late August evenings in Vermont, the kind of blue that seemed to come from inside the atmosphere, rather than reflect off it, the kind that made everything beneath it look chosen. Deliberate. Arrived at. Dorothy thought about what it had cost. Not the money, not the 62,000 or the legal fees or the years of double shifts and weekend work. Those were real, but they were not the cost she meant. She meant the art school acceptance letter that had sat on the kitchen table for 2 days. She meant the shape of the life she had not lived, because the life she had lived had needed her. She did not think about this with bitterness. She thought about it with the particular kind of understanding that only arrived when you were on the far side of enough choices to see the pattern they had made. The understanding that a life was not a sequence of events that happened to you, but a series of decisions about what mattered compounded daily over decades, until the decisions and the person became the same thing. She had decided at 22 that her mother mattered more than her ambition. She had decided at 41 that Claire's future mattered more than her own security. She had decided standing in a blizzard on a mountain in the dark that Wren's life mattered more than her own exhaustion. And that decision had led her one stumbling, falling, refusing to stay down step at a time directly to here. She was not the woman Marcus Hale had disposed of. She was the woman he had accidentally sent home. The fire in the stove burned on. The mountain held its ground. And the woman who had been thrown away like a problem sat in the August evening with her granddaughter's breath warm against her arm, and felt settling into her bones with the permanence of something that had earned its place there. The particular and irreducible satisfaction of a person who had done what needed doing and built what needed building and was at last exactly where she was supposed to be.